Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The British prospect Joe Joyce has made a big-time statement, signing with US boxing power broker and heavy hitter Al Haymon. So he's now being advised by Al Haymon. So what I'll do is get to Joe Joyce's official statement and then talk about my thoughts on the signing itself, because I think it's a very good move for Joyce. And then the obvious question is, well, where does all this leave David Haye? Because if Joyce is trading in the United States now under Abel Sanchez, and he's going to be fighting in the US by the looks of it, is David Haye now surplus to requirement? That's a question that a lot of us will be asking, and no doubt we're going to hear something on this soon. But first, to Joe Joyce, his official statement. I'm delighted to announce my management company, S-Jam Boxing, and I have teamed up with Al Haymon. I am excited to now have Al advising me in my career. My US debut will be announced imminently. The Juggernaut is coming. Hashtag Al Haymon, hashtag the Juggernaut, hashtag S-Jam Boxing. No hashtag for David Haye there, but when you do click this here on Instagram, it's got Ringstar. And Ringstar is under the banner, I think it was Haymaker Ringstar. So I'm not sure if the Ringstar is just the Richard Schaefer portion of the promotional side, where Haymaker Ringstar is the joint venture between Ringstar and Haymaker. But anywho, so Joe Joyce signing with Al Haymon. Big time move. I think it's a very good move by Joe Joyce, because at 32, he wants to get cracking. And if we have a look at his record here, he's 5-0. 5 fights in the past year since turning pro in October 2017. So 5 full fights. Ian Lewison knocked him out in 8 rounds. Rudolf Josic, first round KO. Donnie Palmer, first round KO. Lenroy Thomas, that was for the Commonwealth strap, and Joe Joyce did look like a juggernaut in that he just bullied Thomas, took no prisoners, and he knocked him out in 2, and he looked pretty good in that fight. And then Ivica Bikurin in his next fight, which was back in June, your call at Bethnal Green. Well, that was another first round KO, and it was a bit of a bizarre one, that, because Bikurin looked like he took a shot to the top of his head. And when I say the top, I mean like his hair, not his actual head. And it was a bit of a phantom punch situation by the look of the replays. Didn't look right, and he went down like in a screaming heap. And Joyce got the KO. Bikurin didn't want to be in there, and it was all over pretty quickly. It was a bit of a farce, actually. But he was a late replacement. And Donnie Palmer, he was somewhat late in a late replacement. Rudolf Josic, from memory, that was a similar situation. I'd sort of booked these dates in, and this was the sort of best opposition that David Haye could get for Joe Joyce. And some of it sort of runs counter to what they had been hoping for. They talked about in Joyce's early days, obviously starting with Ian Lewison, that was a statement that they wanted to really push Joyce along, get him to a title shot very quickly. But somewhat his career has stalled a little bit, because sure, he got the Lenroy Thomas fight, but after that, just for love nor money, can't seem to get a decent opponent. Ivica Bikurin, that was, I think it was Richard Lartey was going to be the replacement opponent for someone else who had pulled out. And they got him, I think it was a day or 2 days before the fight, very late notice. And not the sort of guys and not the sort of fights that Joe Joyce needs to be in, especially when he's 32 years old and looking for a title shot. So cue Al Haymon. This is a very good move, because Al Haymon, a big-time name in the sport. He is responsible for Premier Boxing Champions. They've got a number of cards on a number of different networks. Maybe not as many cards as we'd like to see, but it's going to give Joyce some scope to actually be on some cards, some bigger cards, and potentially get some better fights, because Al Haymon does tend to put his fighters in with other good fighters. So he's matching them. I mean, a good example at heavyweight that we've got coming up on the Danny Garcia and Sean Porter card in September is Adam Kanelski and Charles Martin. So, in some parts of the world, that sort of fight would never get made, but that fight is being forced upon those two, and it really is, I wouldn't say it's a 50-50, but it's not too far off, and Kanelski, he goes in the favourite, but Martin is no mug. And it's those sorts of fights that Joyce needs to be in. He needs to have stronger opposition. He needs to have more Lenroy Thomas type opponents and above. No offense to the rest of the guys. Ian Lewison, he didn't come as sort of in shape or as good as advertised. But the rest of these guys didn't put up much of a fight. Donnie Palmer, Rudolf Josic, and Ivica Bakurin were dealt with really swiftly, first round KOs. But Joyce, he needs these big fights, and Al Haymon can probably get him into position for some bigger fights than he can currently get. So I'll get to David Haye in a moment. But in terms of the US scene, I could see that there's a bit of an opening there for Joyce to make a bit of a name for himself. Because at the moment, we've got not a huge number of guys that are really making a mark and building a massive profile. Sure, you've got Deontay Wilder with the WBC belt, Jarrell Miller to a lesser extent. Then you've got a few guys that are sort of on the scene, but not making or not fighting enough to really make a splash with fans. So I think you'd count Bryant Jennings among that, Andy Ruiz Jr., Dominic Breazeale. I mean, Breazeale's been on the shelf for 9 months now. Then you've got a few other guys, Kanelski and Martin. And Martin's been very inactive. Kanelski, he hasn't fought a whole lot either. So signing with Al Haymon could potentially get him to a title shot much quicker if he can start working over some of the US heavyweights. Obviously, he doesn't want to sort of just, be bashing journeymen week in, week out. He needs to have some of these contender-level fights, and he's been thirsting for that. And it makes sense for him to fight in the US because he's now being trained in the US as well. So he signed with Abel Sanchez a few weeks back now. He's been training at Big Bear already, been there just to check the place out, check out the surroundings and sort of get into the Sanchez system. So I could see that Joe Joyce could sort of campaign in the US for some time to come. And that brings the question back to David Haye. Where does all this leave David Haye? Because obviously Haye has been promoting Joe Joyce. Not exactly sure what the arrangements are, but if you look at the situation, if he's got Al Haymon and he's got opportunity to fight on some shows in the United States, and he's saying a fight is coming imminently, it's going to be announced, and then he's training in the United States, is David Haye a bit of a spare wheel now? So it might be a situation where he hasn't sort of ditched David Haye yet because perhaps contractually he can't, but at some point you'd have to wonder what's going to happen there. He's probably going to leave David Haye. And if you look at some of the comments here that were posted on his Instagram, well, I won't read that one out, but you can read that for yourself. You still with David? Great decision. Goodbye, Mr. David Haye. I think a lot of us will be thinking that way. David Haye probably surplus to requirement now, waiting for a statement on that. Even if he is with Haye, for the short term, I'm sure David Haye would talk it up and say, look, he's a big part of Joe Joyce's career. He can offer him a lot and yada, yada, yada. I think the writing's on the wall. The relationship's probably going to end at some point, and David Haye's probably going to be off the scene. And you'd have to ask yourself, is the Haymaker stable really set up to support Joe Joyce in any meaningful way now? Haye has been shedding a few fighters. Some of the events, they've been okay, but it hasn't maybe gone as swimmingly as he would have hoped. He's been looking to build his stable, build his brand, and maybe things have stalled out a little bit. And clearly he hasn't been able to get Joe Joyce some of the fights that he potentially should have, could have, and it certainly looks like he is in a position where any fight for Joe Joyce, he's going to have to overpay. Whereas someone like Al Haymon, advisor to a plethora of boxing stars, he's got a big stable under him, that he's involved in the management of. That sort of power and influence, he will be able to set Joyce up with some fights. So I really think that the signing bodes well for Joe Joyce. And potentially, you think about the scene in the UK at the moment, it's booming. There's a number of big stars that have emerged from the UK scene. Anthony Joshua sort of obviously top of the tree. But then you've had some other guys who are getting some shine as well. Dillian White, he's had a couple of good wins recently. And then obviously you've got other guys coming through. Tyson Fury, he's coming back. You've got Daniel Dubois. There's a few other guys starting to make a name for themselves. And perhaps Joyce, moving to the US, it's a little bit less crowded there. Some of the fighters don't fight as often, and they don't seem to really have a profile. And Joyce, if he can sort of build a bit of buzz potentially fight a few contenders. He could maybe cut a couple of steps out that he would have to go through if he was to fight in the UK under David Haye promoted events. But yeah, I like this signing with Al Haymon. I think it's going to offer a lot. And Abel Sanchez, I think he can really teach Joe Joyce a few things too. That obviously came about with Joyce's former trainer Ismael Salas going into a semi-retirement of sorts. Obviously that wasn't going to work for Joe Joyce, and Salas retired to wherever it was in Central Europe that he was going, wherever it was in the continent. And Joyce was left at a bit of a loose end. But what Salas did show us with Joyce is he's still coachable. He's obviously been accused previously being a little bit novice-y in terms of a style, that amateur pedigree that he's got. He sort of looked like a bit of an amateur fighter because obviously he was a top amateur and certain things were ingrained over a period of years. But Salas was starting to, get him to show some different looks and do some different things, some things that maybe we weren't expecting to see from Joyce, who obviously had been considered a bit of a banger, sort of a bit of a plotter, but he's showing that he can do a few things nicely in terms of movement around the ring, a few new looks that maybe we hadn't seen. Obviously, the Lenroy Thomas fight was a little bit different. He just came forward and just was looking to get him out of there. But a couple of other fights, obviously at low-level opposition, he's shown us a couple of things. And that gives me a bit of optimism to think that Sanchez will be able to bring some more out of Joyce. So I actually like this, and I'd like to see Joe Joyce back in the ring soon. He needs to get cracking. He needs to make his mark. And Abel Sanchez and Al Haymon, he's got that sort of set up now. Be interesting to see what happens. Be interesting to see what David Haye has to say about it all. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.